I'm Dr. Stephen Andrew Missick, and welcome to this episode of the St. Jude Thaddeus story. And unfortunately, there's been a break. I haven't been able to put out more programming, but something very interesting has happened. And I want to talk about some exciting new discoveries about the life of St. Jude Thaddeus. Now, I want to mention that I am working on a new series, and this is called The Legendary Exploits of the 12 Apostles. And I'm writing a book, so I'm doing it chapter by chapter. And so far I have 4 chapters done. And chapter 1 is this one, The Legendary Exploits of the 12 Apostles. And this is an overview of what the whole book will be about. It's a short overview of the entire book. And I do mention each one of the 12 apostles and the traditions associated with them. So, Chapter 1 is just a brief overview. Chapter 2 is the lost acts of the apostles. And in that, I talk about certain important things that involve the 12 apostles that we know are totally historical. We're not talking about legends, we're not talking about traditions, we're talking about historical facts. Such as, for instance, the fall of Jerusalem, the destruction of the temple, but also the burning of Rome. It's a very famous story from Roman historians of how Nero is a vain, corrupt Caesar. He had Rome burnt because he wanted to rebuild it in his own image, and it was horrific. So he blamed the Christians, and he rounded up believers. He crucified them at night and used their body. He burned them, used them as lamps to light crucified Christians as lamps to light the city of Rome at night. It's horrific. But this isn't legend, this isn't myth, this is from Roman historians. And of course, he rounded up the apostles, including Peter and Paul. Paul was beheaded and Peter was crucified, and according to tradition, he was crucified upside down. So then I have, I also have the story of the 72 disciples as well. And one of these booklets is the teachings of the 12 apostles, where I look at the Bible, but also at extra biblical material. So we have an overview, a book on the teachings of the 12 apostles, based on like the Apostles' Creed and things like that. The lost chapters of the book of Acts, telling several stories, including the burning of Rome. Stories that are not legendary or traditional, but verifiably historical about the 12 apostles. And then the 72 disciples of Jesus. So I think this is going to be a very important series. And like I'm saying, when we get... we need spiritual renewal, and I think the way to have spiritual renewal is the restoration of the original faith preached by the apostles. So these booklets are out. Contact me if you want some copies of them. I'll send them to you. But also, that's a work in progress. I want to talk about the story of St. Jude Thaddeus, and this is a recommended book. This is Eusebius. The Ecclesiastical History, the Church History of Eusebius. This is translated by Paul Elmar. I read an older translation years ago when I was still in high school. It's kind of antiquated English. The prose didn't flow very well. But I enjoyed the book regardless. I think it's a translation from the 1800s. But this is a very important book. Of course, if you're talking about extra biblical history, we have Josephus. But you also have the father of church history, Eusebius. And what did Eusebius do? Like I said, this is a fresh, modern translation, easier to read, and it's got a lot of graphics and maps and photographs in it. So this is in charts. This is very helpful. So who was Eusebius? I talked about this in earlier videos in this program. As I mentioned, Eusebius is the father of church history. So what had happened was Constantine became emperor. He came out publicly saying he's a Christian. He professed faith in Christ publicly. And then he ended the persecution of Christians. And not all Roman emperors persecuted Christians. It's kind of sporadic, but there were some terrible persecutions. And some of the worst persecutions were not too long before Constantine converted, proclaimed his faith in Christ, and released an edict of toleration and put a permanent end of the persecution of Christians in the Roman Empire. When I was in Egypt, the Egyptians began their calendar, Egyptian Christians, with year one for them is the persecution of Diocletian, because so many Coptic Christians were killed. And I mean, even though there were some more tolerant emperors now and then, a lot of the persecutions were terrible. And it's all, it's inspiring in a way to think about, what the early Christians went through. The persecutions they hit hard, and then you never knew, right, the instability. Will this, when the persecuting emperor dies or is deposed, you don't know the future. It's an uncertain future. Will this new emperor relax the persecutions, or is it going to be as bad, or maybe not as bad, but still bad, or worse? You lived in uncertainty and persecution. And so it's a very difficult time. It's very inspiring just to look at the lives of these people who gave their lives for their faith. So there's just a lot of stories of the martyrs and the persecution that early Christians endured. So what happened is Constantine becomes emperor. Eusebius is a prominent Christian thinker and a bishop, and he's written a lot of books that have survived to this day. So when Constantine becomes the emperor, Eusebius decides to write a history of the church, picking up where the book of Acts leaves off and writing to his own day. So he does have the story of St. Jude Thaddeus. And in Aramaic, Thaddeus is called Addai to this very day, Mar Addai. So, like I said, it's an important story, and Eusebius went to the city of Edessa, and he found in the records the story of St. Jude Thaddeus, Mar Addai, going and evangelizing the Assyrians. And what happens, though, is Eusebius records this story, but modern scholars are kind of skeptical. So we do find this story in here. So here we have this section, a whole chapter given to the story of St. Jude Thaddeus. It says, Thaddeus and the Prince of Edessa, King Abgar, and the correspondence with Jesus. So we have this these footnotes here, and it says the addendum is somewhat condensed since the original is incredibly redundant and obviously contrived. No factual matter, however, has been surrendered. So a lot of scholars, they read the story of St. Jude Thaddeus and the story of King Abgar, which I go into greater detail in other videos, and they look at it and say, well, this is not historical, this is not factual, this is just a legend. This is something that people made up. We don't know that for certain. We don't have the... So Eusebius went to the city of Edessa. He went to the city archives, and he found in the archives of the royal city, official documentation of the story of St. Jude Thaddeus. So, but what modern scholars say is, yeah, he probably did find these documents in there, but somebody slipped them in. A forger somehow got these forged documents into the city archives. That's what most modern scholars say, and that's what this translator. I'm not saying you shouldn't get this book or read it. I'm just saying that's his opinion. This is worth having and worth reading. So the interesting thing is, here we have this other book, because we're talking about the Assyrian Christians and the story of their founding, and that's the story of St. Jude Thaddeus, or Mar Addai, going and preaching to the Assyrians. It's like for Americans, George Washington. He's like a founding father. So St. Jude Thaddeus is like the founding father of the Assyrian nation as it is today. Of course, they remember the Assyrians of old as their ancient ancestors, but the Assyrian culture as it exists today, it's like St. Jude Thaddeus is the founder of that society and culture. So we have this book. This is called The Syriac World, edited by Daniel King, and this is a very good book, a very thorough examination of the Syriac Christian heritage. And Syriac is a form of Aramaic, the language that Jesus spoke. This also has a lot of graphics of churches and archaeological artifacts and monuments in China and Mongolia, around the whole world, where Assyrians went preaching the gospel. But when they look at it, the story of St. Jude Thaddeus, or Mar Addai, they would say, what they say is that there was a Manichaean. This is what they say. there was a Manichaean named St. Jude Thaddeus, or Mar Addai, that this person wasn't even a Christian, and he was an evangelist. This is what they say in this book, that the real Addai wasn't even a Christian. He was a Manichaean, a Gnostic that was, preaching the Manichaean faith. And what happened is later on, Assyrians seized on the name of Addai, or Thaddeus, and said, well, this is one of the apostles of Christ, and they created this legend about St. Jude Thaddeus that doesn't have historical basis, and the real Addai was actually a Manichaean. But something interesting happened, and of course, we're talking about Gnosticism. This is a collection of Gnostic. Well, not all these documents are Gnostic, but many of them are. This is the Nag Hammadi codices. Around the time the Dead Sea Scrolls were discovered, the Nag Hammadi codices were discovered. It's very interesting. What are the Dead Sea Scrolls, really quick? Well, it was a library with a lot of sectarian documents, a lot of Bibles, but also sectarian literature and other forms of literature. Extra biblical books. You have three types of literature found among the Dead Sea Scrolls. First, biblical manuscripts, several books of the Bible. Almost every book of the Bible, except for Esther, was found among the Dead Sea Scrolls. Certain books have multiple copies. And then there are books we call apocryphal texts, like the book of Enoch, the book of Tobit. Of course, Catholics use the book of Tobit as part of the Bible, but Protestants don't. So from the Protestant perspective, Tobit is like an extra biblical book. So the book of Tobit was found among the Dead Sea Scrolls. Then there's another form of literature, which they call the sectarian documents. So you had basically a monastery and a Jewish movement, and they had the rules for their order and their denomination, which is an unknown sect of Judaism. Their literature is found among the Dead Sea Scrolls. So this is a very important discovery because this is a library that was hidden during the Jewish war, I guess between like 63 to 70 A.D. So a library from the time of Jesus has been discovered in 1948. Around the same time, they found a different library of these books. This is a collection. Well, this is a translation of all the books that were discovered. Now, the Egyptian farmers or peasants who found this collection, this library, it's another library, they claim they found a stone box and these books were stored in it. But there's another possibility that that's the story they told, but they're actually grave robbers, because going from ancient Egyptian times, the Egyptians had a habit of burying sacred texts with the dead. It goes back to the Book of the Dead. So regardless of how these books were found or where they came from, if they were buried in a stone box, or if they were, these people were grave robbers, wherever they came from, we have another entire library discovered. And one of the books is the famous Gospel of Thomas. So, but there's other books, and some of these are Orthodox Christian books that represent biblical theology. Some of them are kind of very interesting. That many, like the Gospel of Thomas, has many statements in it that we know Jesus said because they're found in the Bible, and there's a lot of statements in there that sound like something that Jesus would have said. But then you have a lot of strange statements, and like I said, the majority of these books do not represent standard Orthodox or Catholic Christianity. It's some kind of a deviant sect. But the interesting thing is, especially with the Gospel of Thomas, a lot of scholars believe that the Gospel of Thomas does go back to the 1st century or the early 2nd century. So it's a very important ancient document. But interestingly enough, of course, what these people are doing is they're referring, like we have the Acts of Peter here, and like I said, not all these books. Some of these books would be considered heretical, but some of them are not. So we have like the Acts of Peter and stories of other apostles among these books, like the Acts of Peter and the 12 Apostles, the Act of Peter. But interestingly, Mar Addai is mentioned in this book, and the book he's mentioned in is the first Apocalypse, the first revelation of James the Just. And so he says, he goes, I want you to teach these things, reveal them to Addai, As soon as you leave, there'll be a war waged in this land. So we, for anyone who dwells in Jerusalem, it's talking about the Jewish war, Rome fought against the Jewish people. Let Addai take these things to heart. From the 10th year, Addai is to sit down and write them out. And when he's written them out, they're to give them to, there's breaks in the text. He gives them to Levi, one of the other apostles, and he's to bring forth these words and pass them on to his sons. So scholars date the first apocalypse of James to around the year 200. And that's before Mani was even born, before Manichaeism formed. So here we have an ancient, and if it's dated by scholars to 200 AD, could possibly be later, but it's most likely even older than that. So that means the first apocalypse of James dates to the 2nd century. And it mentions Jesus speaking to James about Addai. It has his name in here, and it mentions how he's the founder of the Assyrian church. So what does this mean? Why is this significant? Well, I think that blows a hole in the theory. When they were saying it was a Manichaean, I was thinking, it's like, well, how do we know that this person, you're saying that the real historical Addai and Thomas and these other people were not the apostles, but Manichaeans who had the same names. So it's like, well, couldn't you argue that maybe they were named after these apostles because you already had these stories? So I'm not denying there's a person called Addai who may have been a Manichaean. It's possible, right? But if he has a name like Addai, couldn't he be named after the earlier Addai, one of the 12 apostles? But that's the story they would say. No. This Addai wasn't even a Christian. He was a Manichaean that is converted by Mani, who was a Gnostic. But then we have a text that dates to the 2nd century, that mentions Jesus talking about his disciple Addai over 100 years before Manichaeanism and decades before Mani was born. So it seems like this isn't something that was just contrived or made up. We have in this ancient literature that there was an apostle, Thaddeus or Addai. That form is used in these texts. So when I look at the Nag Hammadi codices, I've studied Gnosticism to a certain extent, but I'm more interested in biblical theology. And among these books, I'm interested in the Epistle of Silas or Silvanus, and the Act of Peter, and also the Gospel of Thomas. Some of these other books in here haven't been interested in reading. But then, these scholars try to discount and dismiss the even existence of Addai. And here we find in an ancient apocryphal gospel written, over 100 years before Eusebius wrote his church history, Mar Addai or Thaddeus is mentioned. He's attested to. So I think that gives credence to the story. This wasn't something made up after the Manichaean movement, but there's already have text talking about Mar Addai, like I said, written decades before the birth of Mani, and almost 100 years or over 100 years before Manichaeanism became this religion. So it's very interesting, and we need to continue to delve into the story of St. Jude Thaddeus.